Cuban Missile Crisis. I read an article one time many years ago that the Cuban Missile Crisis was actually started when the Soviet Union built an intercontinental ballistic missile, and we were watching them with our spy satellites, and all of a sudden we noticed where we were watching it because we thought that it was the moon rocket. And all of a sudden a big gray blob appeared where the supposed moon rocket had been. We asked the Soviets what's the meaning of this gray blob, and they didn't give a good answer. We later learned that this gray blob was actually an intercontinental ballistic missile blown up on the launching pad. And when it blew up everybody in the Soviet Union who knew anything at all about putting together an ICBM. And Khrushchev was terribly upset. I mean, that put his missile program back for several years. So to kind of equal the missile race, he decided to put missiles in Cuba. Meantime, we had some U-2 planes. Now, if you know about the U-2 plane had a huge, huge wingspan. And that meant it could fly higher than just about anything that existed at the time. And it was flying reconnaissance missions over Cuba. And it took some photographs of missile-like shapes in a certain area of Cuba. And further investigation convinced us that the Soviet Union was putting missiles in Cuba. That's 90 miles from American shores. The Soviets replied, well, you have missiles in Turkey. What's the big deal? And we replied, well, we've always had the missiles in Turkey and you've known about them, but these missiles you're putting in Cuba were secret missiles and we're not going to allow it. President Kennedy, John F. Kennedy at the time was a president, he ordered a blockade of Cuba. He said that we're going to surround Cuba with our ships and examine every ship that's coming into Cuba, particularly the ones coming in from the Soviet Union, to make sure that they are not carrying missiles. Now, in actual reality, only one ship was stopped and examined. It supposedly upset the Soviet Union very much. Khrushchev's reply was threatening and violent. The crisis, though, was resolved when Robert Kennedy, who was doing more work in a lot of ways than his brother John, Robert Kennedy negotiated a secret treaty with the Soviets where we secretly agreed to pull our missiles out of Turkey, and they agreed to pull their missiles out of Cuba, and war was averted. Now, it's a good thing perhaps the treaty was secret, because if the American people had known that we had negotiated to pull our missiles out of Turkey, there might have been a lot of people upset at it. As it was, this treaty, as far as I know, was never ratified by the Senate. It was just simply Robert Kennedy got together with some high-up Soviet officials, and they made what's called a gentleman's agreement. They made an agreement without the Congress, without the Senate approving it, which meant it really, in some ways, was not a legal treaty. I personally am not upset with Kennedy for doing so, because, again, in my understanding of government, you sometimes have to do secret stuff. You sometimes have to do things that you just can't tell. You don't like, go ahead and speak up.
The government is not an alien entity.
It's not.
We run the government. We vote for them. They should be incredibly transparent with the people they work for, and they work for 300 million people. So I don't agree with that at all.
Okay. Well,
I don't care.
What was the alternative then that we should have either?
I have no idea. I didn't live during that time, but I just don't like the idea.
I did live through it. We listened to it on the radio, kept our ears tuned to the radio, expecting that we might wake up with a big nuclear holocaust at any time. All right. Anyone else? I mean, hey, your comments are welcome now. Yes?
I have a question. Robert Kennedy had a secret treaty with which?
The Soviet Union. Yeah, where we agreed to pull our missiles out of Turkey, and they agreed to pull their missiles out of Cuba. And this treaty cannot be called a legal treaty, and it was not ratified by our Senate, but nevertheless, we did pull our missiles out of Turkey. Now, we learned about this later. We pulled our missiles out of Turkey for many years over secret, and they pulled their missiles out of Cuba. In the meantime, a line was set up between Washington, well, between the White House and the Kremlin called the hotline, where if something like this happened again, the two presidents, or the president and the premier, could get on a phone and hopefully talk things out and avert a nuclear war. Anyone else have any comments? Richard Nixon, who had lost the election of 1960, said if he had been president, he would have invaded Cuba. Our military advisors advised Mr. Kennedy to invade Cuba. To me, that could have led folk to a nuclear war. I personally think that, all right, on a very personal note, I think President John Kennedy was a louse. But he did one thing right in his life, and that he saved the world from nuclear holocaust in this instance. And that almost atones for everything else he did. I mean, I had a people, but in this instance, he averted a nuclear holocaust. It's like he was the right man for the right job at the right time, and a whole lot of everything else he did was wrong, but this time, he made the right moves, he negotiated one more time, saved the world from nuclear holocaust, and we're here today to talk about it because he made some decisions that averted nuclear war. Again, anyone who wants to disagree, you're welcome to. That's strictly opinionated. But this was probably as close as we came to a nuclear war, was the Cuban Missile Crisis. That same year, we later agreed not only to set up a hotline, but to ban nuclear testing in the atmosphere. We still do nuclear testing underground, but we supposed, because, well, what was happening? The Soviets were exploding huge nuclear bombs in Siberia, supposedly in uninhabited areas. But what was feared, my dad, I believe, went to his grave fearing this, was that radioactivity from the bombs was going to blow in. It would blow from the west to east and blow over the United States. And when my dad was feeling a bit tired, he'd say, I wonder if radioactivity isn't affecting all of us. Now, when it snowed, our family liked to eat snow cream, and we had a couple of snowstorms where we'd get some snow and put vanilla in it and mix it maybe with a bit of sugar. And for many years, my dad would not eat snow cream, afraid it was radioactive. Finally, late in his life, he started making snow cream again. But again, the Soviet Union finally agreed to stop their above-ground testing. We did too. Very famous movie made about the Cuban Missile Crisis called Missiles of October, a movie that I happened to see. I want to say this, about all the movies I've seen that feature President Kennedy, no actor I've ever seen really looks like him. You can duplicate Hitler, just put the right mustache and give him the right hair combing. You can duplicate him. And if you're wondering why I comb my hair back, I once combed my hair to the side like my dad taught me. I said, oh no, that looks too much like Adolf Hitler. So I quit combing my hair that way. But you can duplicate, and Abraham Lincoln, oh yeah, he's easy to do. Just put a beard on some man and you've got Abe Lincoln. But John Kennedy, he had no whiskers, and it's somewhat difficult for an actor to, anyway, at least the ones I've seen have not really looked like him. His brother Robert put a big shock of hair on top of his head, and you might have someone. Anyway, just, now, the communists might possibly have gone farther in taking over the world if it had not been for the fact that they split in two. China became upset at the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union in turn became upset at China. One of the issues was, when Stalin died, Mao said, I should be the head of the communist world. Because after all, I'm the head of the biggest communist country there is, and the Soviets said, no, the leaders should be Soviet because the Soviets were the first communist country, so Khrushchev claimed he was head of the communist world. Mao said, I should be head of the communist world. Didn't agree on that. They didn't agree on, didn't agree on whether how much involvement Russia should have in the wars that were going on. The Chinese wanted Russia and them to get together and engage in a program of conquest. and possibly fight the United States. The Soviet Union did not want to. And the two sides got into a disagreement that to some extent is still going on. China then became more isolated than ever, seemed to have no friend in the world except for North Vietnam and North Korea. Otherwise, it was isolated for several years. Second Indochina War, the first Indochina War was in 1952 or 53, where the Vietnamese drove the French out. Once France was gone, the United States decided to step in. And the United States moved in first with people they called advisors. The Americans would send advisors over to try to advise the South Vietnamese on how to fight and instruct them on the use of weaponry. When it was obvious that that didn't work, the United States became more and more involved. In 1964, President Lyndon Johnson campaigned on a promise that the United States will not get involved in a war in Vietnam, a promise he knew all along he was not going to keep. And as soon as he got elected and sworn into his own term, the war escalated. That promise was called the credibility gap, the gap between what Johnson actually said and what he knew to be true. And yes, Johnson was compared to Machiavelli. Do anything you can to get yourself ahead and don't worry about any moral standard. One of you did your paper that included Machiavelli. Anyway, the war was to go on and on and on. The Chinese gave a little bit of help to the North Vietnamese, but not much. The Vietnam expected that China would come in and fight alongside them like they had in Korea, and China simply wouldn't do it. The Chinese said the Russians should help also. The Russians said, no, you're much closer, it would be too expensive for us to get involved in that war. Now, folks, it is known that North Vietnam went through a period of discouragement. They said to each other, how can we defeat the United States? They have everything. They have Britain on their side. They have Australia. They have the Philippines. I mean, and here we are fighting alone. China is not helping us. The Soviet Union is not helping us. How can we defeat the United States? But then they noticed college-age students, or young men, particularly young men my age, rioting on the campuses, demanding that we get out of Vietnam. So the North Vietnamese said one to another, if we can just hold out long enough, their young people will force them out of this war, which is exactly what happened. My generation, a lot of the men of my generation burned their draft cards, fled to Canada, fled to Sweden, did anything they could to escape the draft. And basically refused to fight. And when they got on the campuses where they were exempt from going to military service, they rioted. The rioting got so bad in my own state of Ohio that National Guardsmen shot dead 4 students at Kent State in 1970, and they closed down all state colleges in the state of Ohio in 1970 and told the students, you come back on the campus one at a time to take your final exams, or a few at a time, but come the fall of 1970, things calmed down. Partly because the war started to de-escalate, and partly because colleges began to look at who's doing the rioting and noticed it was mostly out-of-state students. So the colleges began to jack up the tuition for out-of-state students and make it more profitable for parents to send their kids to colleges in-state. As for the 4 students at Kent State who were shot dead, they were just going about their business. They were not part of the rioting, even though it is true a bunch of other students were throwing rocks and bottles at National Guardsmen. And when the Guardsmen opened fire, supposing self-defense, they hit innocent people who were going about their business. All right. Eventually, President Richard Nixon, who had a lot of success in foreign affairs, paid a visit to China. He met with Mao Zedong, and your book shows a picture of 782 of the two men shaking hands. And Nixon said he was willing to open up talks with China and willing to open up trade with China and give China favored trade status. And Chinese, after all, had no quarrel with Americans. After all, in the 1890s, when other countries were setting up spheres of influence and taking control of China, the United States did not do so. When Japan invaded China, the United States stepped in and helped China defeat Japan. So China really didn't have a big quarrel with the United States, except that China had turned communist. The United States wouldn't recognize them. But President Nixon recognized the communist government of China as the legitimate government. Red China was then admitted to the United Nations, and Formosa was kicked out. Long ago it might have been, but it was. North Vietnam felt more isolated than ever, so North Vietnam finally agreed to a peace treaty. The peace treaty was signed and ratified and took effect in January 1973. The treaty lasted 2 years. Once the treaty was signed, the United States pulled out, or for all practical purposes, pulled out of the war, pulled out of Vietnam, and left Vietnam to fend for itself. Again, the Vietnam War had been one of the longest wars in our history. But in 1975, North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam, and within a few weeks, South Vietnam had completely collapsed. Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, the name was changed to Ho Chi Minh City, and for all practical purposes, the United States had lost its first war. All right. Again, folks, I wish there were more I could say about Vietnam. So, we got involved in there to try to stop the spread of communism. We didn't want it to spread farther. And then once Vietnam went communist, communism did not take over the neighboring countries, and still hasn't. We just assumed that once Vietnam fell, all of Southeast Asia would fall, and Australia would be threatened next, Indonesia would be next. Indonesia has not gone communist, neither has Australia, neither is any place else in that part of the world. We were having a problem fighting the Vietnam. Here's part of the problem. Of course, all of North Vietnam was communist. In the south, they were divided between the Viet Cong on the one hand and the South Vietnamese on the other. The Viet Cong were South Vietnamese who were communist. So basically, what it amounted to was 3/4 of Vietnam was communist, including half of the people who were, and a typical American GI had no idea when he saw a Vietnamese whether this Vietnamese person was friend or foe. This Vietnamese just might start to blow him up or start to blow him away, and they had no way to tell who was who or what was what. And the feeling generally persists to this day that perhaps we had no business being over there.
What do you think?
I'm old enough to have listened to our teachers talk about, and my parents too, we must stop the spread of communism. We contained it in North Korea, to North Korea, when we built up the South Korea. There was a difference though, folk. The South Koreans were partially westernized. We never did succeed in westernizing Vietnam. All right.